So I'm a little excited today, but not for the reasons you may be thinking. I'm getting excited because we are just 2 years away from the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Think about that. Now, most of you are probably a little familiar with that really famous event that occurred on October 31st, 1517. There was a German Roman Catholic monk named Martin Luther, and he nailed this long document to a church door, sort of a church castle door in Wittenberg, Germany. It contained 95 points or complaints. We call it the 95 Theses against the church of that day. It was a turning point in what would become known as the Protestant Reformation, which is an event that we still celebrate and recognize 498 years later. Now, I want you to notice on what Jerry Ann put here on the front of the, sort of the insert, right, in your bulletin. It's a picture, kind of a picture of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the door. So I want you to keep this image in your mind for just a minute. For those of you who may be familiar with Facebook and Twitter and other kinds of social media, can you imagine this happening today, this event, what Martin Luther did 498 years ago? Can you imagine that happening? And I want you to kind of imagine the following pictures, or what we call in the social media world, pics, of Luther, that if he did this today, what would happen, how it would explode all over the internet. There would be all kinds of images, right, of him doing this. So imagine the picture, and then imagine these captions at the end or above the picture. Things like, "I don't always nail things to church doors, but when I do, stuff starts to happen." Now, you have to be familiar with a kind of a famous commercial for that one. Here's another one. "The church door. When did your blog post earn a papal rebuttal?" That's if Martin Luther had a blog, right? Or here's a better one. "Reformation Day, because theology nerds need a holiday too." And there's a picture of Luther like this that I found, discovering he's nailing the 95 Theses on the door, and he turns around and he discovers that a crowd has gathered, and people have been watching him do this, and he turns around and he says, "Oh, hi guys, I fixed your doctrine." And then my favorite one is just simply, "Nailed it." So Reformation Day is one of my favorite Sundays of the year. Not because I am anti-Catholic. My Irish-Italian Catholic ex-nun woman priest wife would not appreciate that. But I like this Sunday because I believe that Reformation is or should be something the church does every day. It's what we should be about. Reformed and reforming. The wider church, denominations, local churches, and individuals should be reforming continually. I like to say, if we ain't reforming, we ain't performing. I just made that up, by the way. If we ain't reforming, we ain't performing. There you go. Metaphorically speaking, Reformation is about a new way of seeing. It's about opening our eyes. So the church in Luther's day had closed its eyes to some of the most egregious abuses of power the church had ever seen. Luther's protestations were against such things as clerical and sexual abuse, nepotism, and, of course, the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences is probably the best known of Luther's protestations. Now, what is an indulgence, you might ask? in the context of the church. The simple definition is this: it is a way to reduce the amount of punishment one has to undergo for sins. To reduce the amount of punishment that a person has to undergo for their sins. And a popular way to do this was to pay the church money in order to reduce the punishment. Forgiveness, in other words, was for sale. It had become commercialized. By the later Middle Ages, in the time of Luther, the commercialization of indulgences had become a serious problem, which the church recognized, but it was unable to restrain effectively. Eventually, after the Protestant Reformation began, there was a Catholic counter-Reformation, and they were able to curb some of the excesses of indulgences. The church began to see what it was doing. It had opened its eyes. It became more self-aware. Both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation were eye-opening movements within Christianity. And now, 5 centuries later, you and I are asked to open our eyes to see things in a new way, because we are, or should be, always in Reformation mode. Let's turn to the Bible for a little insight, pardon the pun, just a little insight into what I'm talking about. The Bible contains many examples of the metaphor of seeing, opening one's eyes, overcoming spiritual blindness, and things of that nature. Let's begin with Job. Today's reading, as I said earlier, comes from the very end of the book of Job, where the main character begins to see things a little more clearly. Job begins to understand that there are things that are beyond his understanding, and that sometimes we just need to trust God. Job says, "I had heard of you, God, by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you," which means I understand you better now, God. Earlier in the book, Job had demanded to see God because he said God had hidden his face from him. And Job finally hears God in a thunderous voice, which is the way he saw God, by hearing God. Because we don't actually have to see someone to see. That is, to understand someone. The point of the book of Job is that Job came to an understanding of God. And as Christians, you and I strive to see God as well. That is, we seek to understand God, which of course is a lifetime quest. So that's the first point, understanding God. Seeing God in a way that helps us understand. The writer of Psalm 34 also uses the metaphor of seeing, but there's a slightly different twist to his understanding of seeing. Psalm 34 is a psalm of thanksgiving. The writer is so thankful that he continually praises God. And the main reason he is so thankful is that God has delivered him from all of his fears. Now imagine that. All of your fears have gone away. There's no need for a therapist here, right? I would love for God to deliver me from my claustrophobia and my fear of heights. I mean, whatever your fears are, wouldn't you love for God to do that for you? But this is what the psalmist is claiming. All of my fears have been delivered. And then the psalmist says that God saved him from every trouble, And then, in response to that, he says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." He's using the word see as sort of a metaphor, not see visibly, but and taste is a metaphor as well. But come to experience the Lord as good, he says. So whereas Job comes to understand, or comes to a better understanding of God, the psalmist has a profound experience of God. For the psalmist, to see God is to experience God. Okay, then we come to our third reading. This is from the Gospel of Mark. And here Mark provides yet another slightly different angle on this metaphor of sight, of seeing, spiritual seeing. As the story goes, there was a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. Now, that's really not a name. We think his name is Bartimaeus, like that's a different name, but it's really not a name. Bartimaeus literally means son of Timaeus. So it's saying, son of Timaeus, son of Timaeus. That's what it means literally. The man is so insignificant that his father's name is given, but his name is not given. And I started thinking about that. Well, maybe this is sort of a first century way of saying that he was Timaeus II, or that he was called Junior. I think maybe he was called Junior. Maybe his parents called him that. Hey, Junior, come here. So he never had a name. It was just son of Timaeus. That's just sort of a sidetrack, right? He can't physically see. He's blind. And then he hears that this famous healer, Jesus of Nazareth, is walking by. And so he calls out for mercy. And Jesus says, come over. So Mark writes that the man threw off his cloak and sprang up to go see Jesus. He was a little bit excited, right? Jesus asks him what he can do for him, knowing full well what it is. And Bartimaeus, Jr., says, my teacher, let me see again. His wish is granted. He regains his sight, and not surprisingly, he becomes one of Jesus' disciples. We forget about him. He's not listed in the 12, but he began to follow Jesus on the way. So in this story, seeing equates to following the Christian path. 3 different biblical stories that all use the metaphor of sight with 3 different angles or nuances. For Job, seeing is understanding. For the psalmist, seeing is experiencing. And for Bartimaeus, seeing is following. Understanding, experiencing, and following. Now, physical sight is something that often needs a little attention and a little TLC. How many of you have to wear glasses or contacts? Most, pretty much all of us, right? Let me ask it another way. How many of you do not need glasses at all or contacts? Anybody? Way back there, okay. Well, probably the youngest guy in here, right? I have really good, I'm farsighted. I have good vision from a distance. And yet, like many people, I didn't wear glasses growing up. I never had 20/20 vision and all that. But when I reached the age of 40, things began to go downhill if I tried to read something. So for the last 15 or so years, I've had to use these sort of things, the little cheap reading glasses like many of you have. And every few years I have to get a little bit of a stronger pair, right? Well, just like physical eyesight, spiritual sight can deteriorate over time if it is not constantly cared for. The Protestant Reformation and the subsequent Catholic Counter-Reformation represents a time in history when the church began seeing in a new way. It regained its vision. In Luther's day, the church had lost its vision and needed a new way of seeing things. So people like Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, the radical reformers, the Catholic reformers, gave Christianity a new way of seeing things, a new vision. They provided the lens through which many people began to understand, experience, and follow the Christian path in a new and better way. And yet, if we think that the glasses we received from the 16th century still work for us today, we would be mistaken. Every generation requires a new set of spiritual glasses. Every generation needs to take their glasses off, clean their lens at the minimum, or get a new pair of glasses altogether. Every generation needs to reevaluate how they understand, experience, and follow the Christian path. This has always been true, and it will always be true. And so here we are on Reformation Sunday, 498 years after Luther's famous act of defiance. What would Luther post on the Mac door building today if he were here? What would he put on that door, over here or over here? That's a good question. What changes, in other words, should we make? What should we do differently? If anything, Reformation Sunday should move us to become more self-aware, to think seriously about how we might better understand, experience, and follow the path of Christian discipleship in our own place and time. And another question is, who are the reformers in our midst today? Any or all of us could be modern-day reformers, but I'm going to get a little specific and name a couple of people. First, I would like to propose that the new President and General Minister of the United Church of Christ, John Dorhauer, is somewhat of a modern-day reformer. At least he's been put in that position where he can be, and I think he's trying to be. Dorhauer has been very proactive. By the way, how many of you have heard the name John Dorhauer? I'm just curious. Not many, so I'm bringing him to your attention. He is the President and General Minister of our denomination. He's our Pope Francis, okay? Which I'm going to mention in a moment. But John has been very proactive since he became the leader of the United Church of Christ earlier this year. And I could spend quite a bit of time talking about some of his activities and proposals for the future and things like that. But I thought I would mention just one thing, the one that came out this past week, and it intrigues me the most. Dorhauer is seeking to have 30 leaders of the national staff connecting with the local church, with local churches on a daily basis. Think about that. Part of that engagement involves making a phone call each day to a local church. Another part of it means having the leaders of the UCC out in the field, that is, living out amongst us and being in the local churches at least, in some cases, half of the Sundays of the year. So making these phone calls, asking them what they are doing and what makes them proud to be part of that church. And I find this to be a very refreshing course of action, a way to connect the national offices with the local churches. In fact, Dorhauer said, we want to create an ethos where every church knows that they matter. And I think he may have gotten this idea to call churches from the other person that I think is a modern-day reformer, Pope Francis, who occasionally, you may have heard stories, will pick up the phone and call random people around the world. Have you heard about these stories? Somebody will be sitting in their kitchen one day and all of a sudden the phone rings and it's Pope Francis on the phone. It's kind of interesting. You ought to Google that and read a little bit about that. Doesn't matter, Catholic, Protestant, whoever's doing it, that sort of thing. I think Luther would be proud. Our little Luther would be proud of both Dorhauer and Francis, and anyone that does that sort of thing. Whenever the church acts in a way that brings us closer to what Jesus called the kingdom of God, whoever does that, whatever setting that happens, the church is reforming. So always remember, this is your slogan for the day. If we ain't reforming, we ain't performing, right? Let us pray.